The Israel-Palestine conflict is complex. It's rooted in national, political, territorial, cultural, and religious factors. Israelis and Palestinians both want the same thing: land.
One side has a state, the other one does not. It's not just about land, but it's about having the right to self-determination. This is not a conflict between Jews and Muslims or Jews or Arabs. It doesn't go back to the biblical times or the Old Testament at all. This is a relatively modern conflict.
The origins of the conflict can be traced back to the late 19th century. The Ottoman Turkish Empire ruled the land along the eastern Mediterranean from 1516 to 1917.
Judaism emerged in the Middle East. Islam emerged in the Middle East. Christianity emerged in the Middle East. They shared the same place for hundreds of years under the Ottoman Empire. What changes in the late 19th, early 20th century? We have Jewish nationalism, we have British colonialism.
The Ottoman Empire fell after the Allied powers defeated the Central Powers in World War I in 1918.
It became a British mandate. It came under the British rule.
Great Britain made conflicting agreements about the future of Palestine to Arabs and leaders of a nationalist movement called Zionism.
Zionism was an ideology and a movement that aimed to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. According to the Zionists in Eastern Europe at the time, Jews constituted a nation. They were not just a religious group, but they were an ethnic group, and they deserved their own state. Jews were being discriminated against and persecuted and harassed and oppressed in Eastern Europe. So they said, we need to establish our own state to be safe and secure, and they chose Palestine to do that.
Historians believe Zionism is a continuation of the ancient attachment of the Jews and Jewish religion to the historical region of Palestine.
However, there was a big problem. Palestine, where they wanted to create their state in, was inhabited by an Arab majority who had been there for more than 1,000 years. Great Britain made another promise to the Arabs living in the region. And they said Palestine was going to be part of an independent Arab state that was going to be established after the war was over. In 1917, Great Britain announced this Balfour Declaration, which is a turning point in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
The document supported the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine and the preservation of the civil and religious rights of non-Jewish communities. It did not mention the political or national rights of Palestinian Arabs.
The British rule basically allowed the Jews to come in, migrate to Palestine, settle in Palestine, and to purchase land in Palestine, in spite of all the Arab resistance. So there were increasing tensions and hostilities between the Jewish community and the Arab community in the region. A lot of Palestinians lost their homes and lost their jobs.
British efforts to bring the Zionists and Arabs together failed, leading to the Arab Revolt of 1936. In response, the British government restricted Jewish immigration and Jewish land purchases in Palestine.
In 1947, Britain decided to refer the matter to United Nations, and they came up with a plan. And this Partition Plan basically said that there were going to be two states in Palestine. There was going to be a Jewish state and an Arab state. This plan was not accepted by Arabs in Palestine because even though only a third of the population was Jewish and the Jews owned only like almost 10% of the land in Palestine, they were given 55% of the territory. The UN Partition Plan was approved by the UN mostly because of the American support. The Jewish community had been preparing for statehood since they migrated to Palestine. They had already formed organizations and institutions that they needed for self-government.
Great Britain eventually withdrew and gave up its mandate over Palestine. On May 14, 1948, the State of Israel was proclaimed.
The neighboring Arab countries declared war on Israel to stop it from consolidating itself. And it ended with defeat for Arabs. And Israel actually was able to even expand its territories.
Israel gained some territory formerly granted to Palestinian Arabs under the United Nations resolution in 1947. In Israel, the war is remembered as the War of Independence.
Almost 1 million Palestinians were either forced to leave the region or had to flee. To this day, Palestinians remember this date, this war, as al-Nakba, the catastrophe. There were 3 more wars between Israel and different Arab countries. The War of 1967 is the most important one because at the end of this war, Israel gained a big victory and it occupied the remaining Palestinian territories. And this occupation was supposed to be temporary. It was regarded illegal by the United Nations. However, the occupation still continues to this day. So West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip are occupied territories, which means they are still under Israeli occupation. All aspects of their lives are controlled by the Israeli government. Their access to water, electricity, basic food items, basic medical supplies, education, employment, their exits and entrances. A lot of Palestinians are living as refugees. And then there are other Palestinians who are still living in Israel as Israeli citizens. But they are also complaining that they're not treated equally and the Jewish citizens of Israel had more rights. We have Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Hamas came into the picture in 1987. During the 1990s and early 2000s, they were engaged in armed struggle against Israel. They had this militant wing, which was responsible for the suicide bombings and some of the violence. It later turned into a political party and gained power in the Gaza Strip after the elections of 2007. Since 2007, because it's recognized as a terrorist organization by Israel, the United States, there have been sanctions in place. And Gaza has been under a blockade. Hamas is the major political actor in Gaza right now, but it doesn't represent all Palestinians. The Israeli government obviously is much more stronger in terms of militarily and financially.
Hamas has unleashed hundreds of rockets and mortars on Israel, but they have not been able to penetrate Israel's so-called Iron Dome, the anti-missile defense system.
Over 1,000 Gaza residents killed, more than 6,000 wounded. Israel has lost 42 soldiers and 3 civilians.
The United States is not a neutral observer. The US is currently providing almost $4 billion every year to Israel in the form of military financial aid. The conflict escalates every few years, but again, there are long-term, deep-rooted problems on the ground that kind of create the environment for the escalation.